I'm here today with Steve Dawson, and Steve is a prominent figure in the Canadian music scene, leaving an indelible mark with his natural and authentic talent. With over 200 albums to his name since the turn of the millennium, including 7 Juno Award-winning records, Steve's musical journey showcases his unwavering dedication. Originally from Vancouver and now based in Nashville, Steve is a versatile artist, sideman, and record producer. His pursuit of excellence has garnered him multiple prestigious awards, including Producer of the Year at the Western Canadian Music Awards 3 times and at the Canadian Folk Music Awards 4 times. He's also been honored with Maple Blues Awards, the Grand Prix de Jazz de Montreal, Blues Blast Awards, and numerous other accolades for his work as an artist and producer. Steve's diverse musical experiences have taken him to global stages, collaborating with esteemed musicians such as Colin James, Byrnes, John Baldry, Bruce Cockburn, and Kelly Joe Phelps, among many, many more. Fusing modern electric instruments with enchanting antique instruments like weissenborns and marxophones, I don't even know what some of those are. Steve's studio productions reflect his boundless creativity. The Henhouse, Steve's beloved studio, has been a hub of creativity, nurturing over 80 releases. Previously located in Vancouver and now nestled in the heart of Nashville, this welcoming space continues to attract musicians from far and wide. In 2022, Steve showcased his passion and talent with the release of 3 mesmerizing albums, Gone Long Gone, Phantom Threshold, and Eyes Closed Dreaming. These records embody his unwavering dedication to crafting soul-stirring music that resonates with audiences worldwide. Thank you for joining me today. Steve.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Really nice to see you too. So Steve and I were up at CAP at the same time many, many moons ago. We crossed paths back in those days. Do you want to tell us your story briefly for our listeners? Flesh it out a little bit from the bio for listeners who might be having their first introduction to you today. A bit about who you are and your journey in the biz.
Sure. Well, I started out in music mostly as a live performer, playing in rock bands and things like that around Vancouver, and then gradually, as that scene, this was like in the 90s, and so there was like a pretty strong independent music touring situation happening both in Canada and in the States, and so we started doing that was with I had a band at the time called the Spirit Merchants that was myself and Jesse Zubat, another Vancouver guy, and Jesse and I we sort of like darted across the country a bunch of times and then through the States a bunch of times, just kind of like crazy young person touring, making no money and all that kind of stuff. So we did that for
isn't that the thing, crazy young person touring.
So we did that for a few years, I guess, and then we're kind of getting burnt out on it, and we started playing a little bit of acoustic music at the time, and that sort of like introduced us into the world of folk festivals, and so through that we got into this festival scene that was like a whole new world. It's like, oh, you can play music and actually like make some decent dough doing it. I mean, not that it was like changing our lives or anything, but it was like, way more money than we'd been getting paid at shitty bars across the country. So that was appealing. And then we started this project. It was the two of us again, but like a completely different project called Zubat and Dawson. And we focused on instrumental acoustic music. And it was kind of unlike what anyone else was doing at the time, I guess. And so that helped us sort of solidify that aspect of playing at festivals and touring. So we had this band that was me and Jesse, usually a guy named Marlo Holder playing bass and Elliot Polsky playing drums. And we did even more touring that way because that project sort of picked up way more steam than our rock band ever did. And so we were able to do some pretty solid gigs and some pretty great festival work and things like that. And so that sort of ran its course after a few years. We made 3 records, and considering how unusual the music was, they did pretty well. And then we kind of went off in different directions, and Jesse started playing more kind of avant-garde music, and I sort of veered more into the Americana realm, I guess. And even though it wasn't called that back then, I guess it was sort of called alt country at that point. And so that's sort of, where we both ended up going. And I started producing records around 2000, I guess. And that was mostly just through like playing gigs and meeting people. And Jenny Whiteley is an artist from Ontario, and she was the first person to ask me to produce a record. And that was in, I don't know, maybe 99 or 2000. So starting from that point, I started producing records. And that to me became more or less the focus of my career, I guess. And so I've been doing that ever since, and gradually built up a studio. The studio in Vancouver was a little on the ramshackle side, but we made it work. And it was just like one kind of big open room. And it kind of like dictated the way that I learned to work in the studio. And I made a lot of records that way. And then, things have happened along the way, and I veered more into playing live again. Like I always played live. I always did my own shows and playing with other people and stuff. So, I was doing quite a bit of playing always. But then around 2016, I hooked up with Alison Russell, who she's a friend of mine from Vancouver as well. And we knew each other, back in like 2099, 2000, 2001 kind of thing. So she'd gone off and started a band called Po Girl, and then she'd started a band called Birds of Chicago. And at that time, they needed a new guitar player. And so I just sort of fit into that thing, and I liked Allison and her husband JT, and that started to become like a thing. And so I started touring again a lot, and we were doing I don't know 100 and some odd dates a year for a couple of years there. And then I also joined a band for Matt Anderson, who's another artist. He's an East Coast artist that I'd produced a record for. And he asked me to tour with him for that tour. And so in that year, that was like 2018, 2019. And I was doing, like 100 and change dates with Birds of Chicago, and then another 40 or 50 with Matt. And so that was a little crazy. And I don't know if it would have stopped. I don't know what would have happened, but COVID just slammed all that to a halt. And so at that point, I, what happened, but basically like I just sort of doubled down again on recording and studio work. And I did quite a bit of work during COVID for production and sessions and things like that. And so that's sort of my overarching story, I guess. But it's sort of taken some turns along the way.
Yeah, but really, like, how great is it to have both skill sets? Because you can have that winding road and go back and forth, and things like COVID that shut so many people down for so many reasons, but you were able to like pivot back to an alternate skill set really easily, because that was the time when everybody went back to recording a lot of music because playing live was not a thing.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. It's been, I had those skills already, I guess, and the equipment. So it wasn't like I was scrambling around, but what I was scrambling around doing during COVID was figuring out other people that I could work with and sort of getting them set up in some way. And so that's what we did. Was we had this whole system going where there was me and Jeremy Holmes in Vancouver, bass player, and Gary Craig, a drummer out in Toronto. And we would have this whole thing going where people could send in a vocal track, and within a week, we'd share files around, and Gary, Jeremy, and I, and sometimes Chris Jestrin on keyboards would get these tracks done for people, like recorded and mixed within a week. And so that was sort of what we were like selling, basically, was this whole process. And it kept us busy. It kept us sort of employed, kind of. And it was out of necessity. It was just like I had to find some way of making a living still, and like all my production work had vanished, and my gigs obviously had vanished. So that was what we came up with, and kind of stuck to it for like 2 years, really. And just recently we kind of phased it out. We kept doing it even like post-pandemic, but I don't know, no one really likes to work that way anymore. So
Yeah.
uh,
Well, I think given the option, I think people prefer to be, in the space
yeah,
together. But there are lots of reasons. Sometimes they are pandemics. Sometimes they're budgetary,
yeah,
where it makes more sense. Or sometimes it's access to players that you wouldn't have access to
that's
otherwise,
very true.
where it makes sense to record remotely that way. And yeah, so uh I think there was a big learning curve for a lot of people. I know there was a piece of software that I think was sort of born in the pandemic, Session Wire, that
Yeah,
I haven't used personally, but I've talked to some people who've used, that sort of facilitates that kind of recording where people are working remotely in
yeah.
different places, but still able to record simultaneously, right?
In theory, but in practice, I don't know if that's really realistic. Like
Yeah.
we like if somebody had come up with like a really concrete way of doing it in real time, virtually pre-pandemic, they would have made $1 billion. But there's just
Yeah.
no way to effectively do it without some sort of delay.
Lag. Yeah.
And that, apparently that's sort of been fixed now, but I don't really believe it, and I don't have the energy to look into it anymore because I don't really work that way.
I understand that.
I know the guys at Session Wire have been doing some good work with that. But most of the people that I know that I worked with, and you had a good point there too about like working with people that I wouldn't normally work with or be able to
Hmm.
because they were set up at home. None of those people are set up at home anymore. Like they're all like they never want to do it again. So, that's sort of what I'm noticing now is like the backlash of that is pretty strong. And I can't imagine really going back into it. So, like occasionally people ask me if I'll do a song for them that way. And it's not
Hmm.
super easy anymore because, like for me to get
Hmm.
Gary in Toronto to play drums, he's got to reset up his kit and all his mics. And like, he's just not set up anymore to do it. And
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
for a while people thought that was going to be like a new avenue of working, but then everyone just started going back into studios and home studio, like definitely more home studios opened up, and some of those have stayed. But in general, like all the people that I know that were set up in their living room and things like that's gone. Those situations are kind of done.
I think the singers I
Mm-hmm.
know that instead of being hired to, and voiceover
Mm-hmm.
actors and things like that, who were used to going in and being called into the studio to sing a jingle or do a VO or whatever, they all got set up at home to work during the pandemic so that, like you say, everybody could keep working. But what I think was not foreseen, particularly in that industry, is the complete loss of social sphere
Yeah,
with that, because those are your peers. Those are your peers. That's your social circle. And when you no longer are going into the studio, there was a huge loss there. And I think, as much as anything, there are other reasons too. When you're doing, tracking yourself, you're not being produced by anybody, and that has its drawbacks. But that, I think, really had sort of some unforeseen challenges that way, that once people could go back into the studio, that's where they wanted to
yeah,
be.
yeah. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty much across the board. Pretty much everyone that I know that
Yeah.
was in that situation is just thankful to not be in that situation anymore.
Yeah.
And I just, like we kind of hit the point of everyone kind of tearing down their home studios, and they're, as far as I'm concerned, like they're gone. So
Yeah.
if I'm going to do some work with somebody, it's usually going to be in person, or it's always going to be in person now.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that could change again or whatever. But I think for the most part, it was out of necessity. And now that that's not a necessity anymore, I don't think anyone's super excited about continuing that process.
Yeah.
For
That makes
vocalists, maybe
sense.
it's a little different, because it's so much easier to do the technical setup of setting up a microphone, singing into it. For other stuff, it's not that easy, and especially for
Yeah.
drummers in particular, it's a real challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And you really, frankly, have to know something about sound production to be able to do that for yourself with anything. But the more the more microphones there are, like drummers, right? And the more you have to know how to set it up properly, because you can do a really shitty job of it
totally.
too, which is not going to sound good.
Yeah. And then, the kind of music that I make is like very organic. And, I hadn't used a click track in probably 10, 12 years. And then suddenly during the pandemic, it was all based around the click again, which to me, it was kind of an interesting process. Like I kind of enjoyed the whole metronomic side of things and got kind of into it again in sort of a weird way. But the click track's off again now.
Yeah.
And
one more piece of backlash.
Yeah,
right?
But it was nice for a while. Like I actually, I wouldn't have wanted to continue working that way for forever, but I got into a thing. I got into a role and I enjoyed it. I liked I liked that kind of collaboration. It worked for me. But I'm glad it's over too.
Yeah. So here on the Vocal Lab, we sort of aim to shine a light into the industry through the lens of what I know now that I wish I'd known then. So with that in mind, if you were starting your career over again, do you want to talk about what you'd do differently, what you'd do the same, that kind of perspective?
I think that's a really hard question because the industry has radically changed so much, like more than most industries, I would say. So, I mean, the way that I started out was basically like playing as many gigs as I humanly could. And I don't know if that's a wise thing or even a possible thing to do anymore because there just aren't that many gigs. Like Vancouver, we could play like 3 times a week and people would come. Like it wasn't just we were playing empty rooms. We were playing like pretty solid gigs. And I mean, that was
you didn't burn your audience out with that.
People were going out and seeing crazy rock bands and stuff. And there's no way you could do that now. So, but for me, like that's how I got to learn to play my instrument properly. And I got to learn how to play in a band. And, a lot of the skills that I learned as a producer, I learned on the stage really too, like how to deal with people and just like learning how to play music together. That all developed by playing live. So it's I just think that's, it's different in Nashville because there are a lot of gigs. But in Vancouver, like if I was starting now in Vancouver, I don't know what I would tell myself to do because like, I feel pretty strongly that really worked for me. The whole like gigging till you drop kind of mentality. There wasn't a lot of planning or anything. But that's just what I did. And I think it really worked for me, but I don't think that's possible anymore. And so hence that's a tricky question. Like I couldn't just drop myself in and say like, oh, produce records, like do that without spending 10 years on the road playing gigs in crappy bars. That just wouldn't work. Like I wouldn't be able to make a record the way that I do if I hadn't slogged it out for that many years. Maybe I could have made it a little easier. I mean, if I thought about it, there's ways I could have like cut some corners probably and like maybe done some things differently with something or other. But I mean, for the most part, it's just such a foreign landscape now compared to when I was starting in particular. Like there was the generation before us where like those guys would play like those gigs where you'd roll into a town and play 6-nighters, and do that and then move on the Sunday to the next gig. I missed that. So like as that was getting phased out, I kind of caught like the last year of it sort of. And so I was a part of it a little bit and I saw it a little bit and I saw the guys that had been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, just like horrifyingly seeing that this was being yanked out from under them and the bar scene was changing.
Yeah.
It was right when that whole thing was like shifting in the 90s. And so I didn't I never missed that because I never saw it. But what I did get that people now don't get is the whole like, oh, you can play the Gastown Music Hall, you can play the Town Pump, you can play the Purple Onion, you can play the Commodore, you can play, like, there was like 30 gigs you could play in Vancouver, and you couldn't play them all, but there was definitely like a lot of gigs.
So many more live rooms than there are now. And the live rooms that are there now are either really big, like you got to have some pull to be packing the Commodore. You know, that's what, 1,100, 1,300 people in there.
I think it's
like
less
that
now because Drew Byrnes,
fire regulations.
He used to pack in like, I think like 1,600 sometimes. But I think it's more, I think legally it's more like 800 or 900 or something like that. But yeah, that's a lot of people.
Yeah. But that's a lot of people.
Back in my early days, like local bands were drawing those kind of people. Like a local, a night of local bands in Vancouver could fill the Commodore. There's no way that would happen now.
Yeah. Nope.
And so, yeah, it's just such a.
But you've got that, or you've got like the corner pub that books music one night a week.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot that's like in between.
Yeah, that's what Vancouver in particular, I think, is missing. Like other cities, they sort of have that still to a certain extent. Like Toronto's got that, and you know, even like Victoria sort of has it better than Vancouver does in a way. Now, Vancouver in particular is really like, because it was such a thriving scene in the 90s and early 2000s. It's really just really noticeable.
Yeah.
And I guess ultimately was part of the reason why I left.
Yeah. When did you make the move to Nashville?
I've been here pretty much exactly 10 years now. So it was 2013, I guess, when I left. And I don't know if it was the right time to move exactly, but I don't regret it. But yeah, there was a lot of factors that played into that. And it was a pretty disruptive move, obviously, in my life. But that's kind of what we were going for, I guess. And yeah, it was just time. It felt like it was time to move on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're going to go somewhere for music, especially country flavored music, Nashville is kind of the place to go, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's crazy things about this city, and you know, the actual country scene, like the commercial country scene, is not even, it's not something that I take part in particularly. Like I do the odd session and stuff, but really, like, there's all these other scenes going on that I really enjoy, and there's a lot of music here and a lot of live music and a lot of studio work, a lot of records are being made here, things like that, that aren't the commercial country thing exactly, but perhaps they're like offshoot. Like the reason that some of the studios here exist is because of that music, even though they do other things. That's what pays their bills, you know?
Yep. So we are in an industry that sees a whole bunch of different levels of music education and music theory to supplement talent. Some people have lots of formal education and some are totally self-taught. And I think that it's an industry that there's not a requirement for one or the other. Both have their place. But do you want to talk about your music education and how it's impacted your work one way or another?
Yeah, I went to Berkeley for a couple of years. I didn't get a degree there, but I went there. And I actually really loved it. So Berkeley has a way of teaching music that's kind of jazz based, even if you're not taking a jazz program. And when I went there, like out of high school, I was sort of picturing myself being a jazz guitarist, I guess. And I was sort of like starting down that path to a certain degree. But I mean, partly I just realized once I was there, like, oh my God, there's people that are so insanely good here. Like I'm just not in that league. And there was just so much other music that I was interested in. And that's when I got into like bluegrass and some country music and acoustic music and fingerstyle guitar and slide guitar, things like that that's sort of what I focused on there. And I found kind of a niche something that worked for me. But because of the jazz approach to everything, like I was taking stuff there that was really interesting to me, like ragtime fingerpicking guitar was a course there, but it was taught from like a jazz theory point of view to a certain extent. Like you had to understand, you know, what the 1 and the 3 and the dominant chords and the minor chord, like you had to understand enough theory to get through it. They weren't just like letting you read guitar tablature. You know, it was like you had to understand that stuff. So the foundation that I learned there of sight reading, I already knew how to sight read because I was a clarinet player in school and I learned how to read playing the clarinet. So, and then I also started playing guitar, you know, during high school or whatever. And so I was able to get my reading skills fairly good. They're terrible now. I haven't read a proper chart for years, but
it's a muscle.
Yeah.
Reading is a
I
muscle.
can do it, but I have to like really sit there and work it out, and it's a real slog for me. But that foundation though of the theory is something that I've never lost, because that's applicable like across the board, no matter if you're playing blues or pop or folk or rock or whatever it is. Like the theory part of it, it's not only important, but it's like it doesn't really leave you, because you're always referring to it in some way or another. And you know, here in Nashville, they have this thing called the Nashville number system, which is not that unusual, and people around the world now are using it more. But it was invented here, like in the 50s, for doing sessions. And really, it was invented because it was a way of writing a chart that wasn't committing anyone to a key. So if you know, if they wrote a song, or if they wrote a chart for a song in C, and the singer came in and they were like, oh, well, we're going to do this in E flat, but it's written like C, F, G, A minor or whatever, then the chart, you have to rewrite it. So the number system was what they came up with here, and it's a shorthand. Like there's no repeats, there's no codas. It's all written out like from beginning to end, and numbers. And so it's just theory. It's just basic theory, you know, so you have to have that knowledge. And the ear training that I had in college also was, you know, really helpful for me to understand the intervals and the relationship of chords and all that kind of stuff has really stuck with me more than the sight reading has. You know, partly because of the instruments I play, you know, like I play pedal steel a lot, and you can't even, it's almost impossible to read the music on that instrument anyway, because there's like 19 ways to play one note. So it's just one of those, it's not like a piano where it's like a middle C is there. It's like, well, it could be one of, it's impossible to write really. So you have to be able to think about things in a different way. And being here in Nashville, that's really been handy, because I didn't have to learn that from scratch. It was like, oh yeah, obviously, like the 1 to the 6 to the 2 to the 4 to the 5, like it sounds like this. I get that. I didn't have to have somebody explain it to me. I had to have somebody explain like how to actually do it, like write it, because there's a way that everybody here writes it. And I also held out for a while. I was like, I'm not from here. I feel like that's sort of weird for me to just like swoop into town and like start writing charts like everybody else. And then after about 6 months of sort of holding out and writing like proper charts, like through Sibelius or whatever that I'd done in Vancouver, then I realized, oh, well, it's way easier to do the Nashville system. So I just started doing that, and I've never done anything since.
I've never heard it referred to as the Nashville system, but it is what I talk to students about, that I think is for someone who, because I think it bridges the gap between people who have all the theory and people who have almost none of the theory.
Yeah.
Like you have to have just the very little basic amount of theory. You just have to know what the degrees of a scale are, really. And you're like major, minor, dominant, like, you know, chord flavors. But I talk to students all the time because it becomes the most universal language for talking about music. And then if you are playing with a guitar player and a horn player,
Exactly.
You don't have to write two separate charts. You don't have to talk in two separate keys. You don't have to do anything, and transposition and all of that. And I think it is the one thing that is sort of theory based that I think is incredibly useful for like everybody to understand, because it makes music a common language instead of everybody talking in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if people are educated in some way, then they can speak that language, but it's not the kind of language that you can, like, even like really great players that have no theoretical knowledge, which there are a lot of, would struggle with that concept, because you're having to put a label on something and they haven't learned what that label is. And so, you just have to go through the process of learning it. But it beyond just knowing the numbers, like, it's really helpful to know what the sounds are too, right? To know what a two minor chord sounds like in the context of a chord progression like that. That's helpful to have that kind of training. And
absolutely.
And I think you have to have training for it. Like, you can't just, I guess maybe you can, if you have perfect pitch, you could maybe magically just be able to do it. But for the most part, like 98% of people wouldn't be able to just magically do that without being taught. You know, this is what that sounds.
Well, even perfect pitch, if you haven't had the theory to understand how to build the chords, that's not a gimme.
Yeah, you have to learn to put a name on it. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to ask, am I wrong in thinking that you were at CAP? Was it just that Jesse was at CAP and you were around?
Yeah. I was around a lot, and I wasn't around the school a lot, but I was around that scene a lot, and most of my friends and pretty much everyone that I played with went to CAP. So,
well, and I would have come out to hear some of your gigs too. So I 100% just processed that as you were at CAP. Like I said at the top of the show.
Yeah, I
didn't
want to correct you at the beginning, but yeah, I did not go to CAP. Even though if I'd stayed in Vancouver, I may well have gone to CAP. But yeah, I did not go at that time.
That's just funny that, but Jesse went to CAP.
Yeah, and Marlo Holder was there, and Dan Perry was there. Like, everyone that I played with went to CAP. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about that transition from performer over to producer and moving over into the production side of things? You touched on it at the beginning, but that's learning a whole different skill set, right?
It is. Yeah. I mean, the definition of producer has really changed over the years too. Like, in the old school definition, and I mean like the classic definition, the producer was strictly there like as a guidance counselor more than anything else. The one exception that I can think of is someone like George Martin, who actually like played instruments, but for the most part, the producer sat there, didn't touch any knobs and didn't touch any instruments. And when Jesse and I were making records, we worked with a guy named Lee Townsend, who produces like a bunch of great jazz stuff. Like he produces all Bill Frisell's records and stuff like that. And he's like the only guy I know that was like that old school producer in that way. And I learned a lot from him because of that. Like he didn't really know anything about equipment or how to do anything technically, and he didn't play an instrument, but he had great ears and he liked music a lot, and he knew what worked. And almost more importantly was he had like sort of a psychology background and was able to kind of like, because Jesse and I were very different we still are very different personalities, and like it took someone like him to be not exactly a referee, but like somebody that was able to kind of like show us where the middle ground was in our crazy minds. And so we were able to work with him to like make that work musically, which I don't know, if we hadn't worked with him, we may not have been able to pull it off. Like up to that point, we'd produced records, our own records, and we were starting to I would say we were starting to like disagree on enough like aesthetically and where we wanted to go musically that we probably couldn't have done it ourselves anymore. And so having somebody like that was really cool. So I learned a lot from him just in that old school production sense and what it means to like kind of be able to pull things from places and from people and situations. But for the most part, production now sort of requires that you have other skills. I think it would be almost impossible to be that guy anymore, where you don't have engineering skills. So, and that's like a budget thing, strictly. Like, very few people have the money to hire a producer and an engineer and a studio anymore. Although they do, like that definitely happens in the upper rungs of music. But in the world that I'm in, which is like, you know, independent stuff and the Americana and roots world and things like that, you know, the budgets are small and they're, you know, I can make records pretty cheap relative to like a big rock record or something that costs a ton of money. And so in order to pull that off, I have to be able to make it affordable to people. And I can do that because I can engineer stuff. So whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know. Sometimes it's a terrible idea. Like sometimes it just doesn't work that well. And it's too many, like really, like ideally that wouldn't be the situation. It just so happens that I really like the technical side of it too. And I guess I'm pretty good at it. I don't know. Like I've worked with enough engineers to realize that I know what I'm doing and I can hold my own. And I've been working on mixing for 15 years now, and I feel like I'm getting pretty good at it, but it took me a long time to learn, and I'm still learning all the time, which is what I like about that side of things. But the production thing is like, you have to have this skill set. And then I have the other skill set of being able to play. And so that for me is where it gets really interesting, because usually I'm playing on projects that I'm producing. And that to me is like, it's a way for me to engage in music and in the recording process that if I was just sitting there, just engineering or just producing, I wouldn't say I would tune out, but I wouldn't be engaged in the same way. If I'm sitting there in the room and I'm 5 feet away from the singer and I'm 8 feet away from the drummer and I'm 3 feet away from the bass player and I'm looking around and we're talking about stuff and like playing it in real time, that is a different level of engagement that I kind of need in order for me to do my best work, I think. And so all those skills come into play in that sense. Like I have to, so when I'm doing that, if I'm producing and playing, I can't engineer because it's too crazy. Although I have in the past. So I can, like I can set up a remote control for Pro Tools. And then if I engineer everything really conservatively, I can do it. So meaning like, if I'm up here, this is my control room. If I'm up here and I'm engineering a session, I'll be doing things that are like kind of aggressive or maybe experimental or whatever, or I'm compressing things kind of extremely because I can control it up here. But if I'm down there playing, I can't do any of that stuff. And so that's what I mean by conservatively. Like I can't be messing around. Like I have to leave tons of headroom in case somebody gets loud. I can't be up here turning it down. So technically I can engineer and produce and play at the same time, but it's definitely too much to think about and do a good job of all those things. Usually I like to factor in having what I consider an assistant. So I still do all the setup and I know where everything's patched in and I know what's hitting what piece of equipment. I make those decisions. So really I'm engineering. I'm just not like monitoring the Pro Tools session. I'm not turning the knobs. So there's a guy and he does that. And I bring him in for sessions where I'm playing and producing. But if I'm just playing, then I can engineer stuff. Or if I'm just engineering, which I do sometimes, then it sort of frees you up to sort of hone in on that particular aspect. But I mean, that's how I've been able to survive basically, is like having those skills that I can draw on and be able to work on them for a long time too. Like I didn't just start, mixing records overnight. Like I've been working on it for a long time. So, there's no shortcut really. I guess there's some people that are so naturally gifted at it that they can just do it, but I don't know. Like even just like if I had the exact same level of competence that I do now I still wouldn't mix something the same way I did 12 years ago, because I just like aesthetically
Yep.
I've changed, or my taste has changed, or I've developed a certain amount of techniques or whatever it is. So that progression I think is important too. And that means that you can't just like plop somebody down and expect them to do their best work if they haven't been doing it for a lot of years.
Yeah. Well, I think styles change over the course of time, and gear changes over the course of time too. So, what gear you had available to you to do the things 12 years ago or whatever is not the same selection you have
Although
now.
I would say that's true, but also that's the least impact.
Yeah.
The gear stuff, like, it's gotten more extensive, I guess. Yeah, it definitely has gotten more extensive and more involved, but I would say it has the least impact of any of the other factors in the whole thing.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair. And you do a super cool thing at your studio in Nashville, I believe. I believe maybe a couple times a year, but you can explain this better than I can. But you want to talk about your Henhouse Hang?
Sure.
And how you're sort of serving the next generation of musicians in your way there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like we're doing that, but so yeah, like basically what it is like opening up the studio to people, for them to experience what it's like to be on a legitimate roots Americana recording session. And so we bring in an artist, and what the artist gets out of it is like complete songs. They don't get paid to be here, but then I pay a group of musicians. So it's basically like as if a session was going on, except there's people milling around. And so I mean, the idea is like I'll actually do some teaching, because I teach here occasionally, like at Blackbird Academy, which is a studio here that has a school, and I do some teaching, and I used to teach guitar lessons all the time. So teaching is something that I've done off and on through my whole career. And so the Henhouse Hang is like a 3-day thing. I teach a bunch of stuff about, like like you can't get super deep into anything, so you have to kind of like figure out what the entry level, what the acceptable entry level is. It's a bit of a juggle too, because like everyone has a different background. Like some people have never seen a microphone, and some people have made 10 records and they just want to see something else. So you have to you can't be explaining what a patch cord is to everybody, or they're going to get really bored. But some people need to know what a patch cord is, so you have to show them. So basically, like, they come in, I teach them about some stuff. All the musicians drop in during the first day and like set up their crap, and I talk about miking, an upright bass, and I talk about miking a piano, and I talk about miking a drum kit, how I do it. Like, I'm not going to sit here and like teach you how to put 15 mics on a drum kit, because I don't do that. But I'll teach you how to get a really good drum sound with 2 microphones or 4 microphones. And so we'll do that. And then everyone goes away, and then I set the room up for the full band. Like, instead of individual instruments, I set the room up as if it was a real session. And then we basically just like cut 2 songs, except people are allowed to ask questions, and they're allowed to move around and stuff. We try and keep the moving to a minimum, and the talking has to happen in between takes or whatever. And so everyone just has to kind of like tune out that whole thing of what's happening and just pretend they're on a session. But we don't dumb it down. And it's like, when the artist comes in, I'll hear the song for the first time, and we do 2 songs. So it's a 3-day thing. We do 2 songs kind of from beginning to end. The only part that I kind of fudge a bit is the mixing part, because it's just like, there isn't enough time. So I kind of do a mix that I think is okay, but then I'll go back and I actually spend a little more time mixing it for reals. But
we'll just call it a rough mix.
So that's sort of what happens. Like, the artist comes, in this case it's a woman, so she'll show me the song, and I'll write a Nashville chart and show everyone how you do that. And hopefully it's not some crazy thing that I can't figure out. usually it's fine. and then we'll go down and go through the process. And the process for me generally is like, we'll sit in the room together, everyone's there, we'll hear the song, we'll get some ideas for instrumentation. Am I going to play a Weissenborn, or am I going to play a guitar or a pedal steel? Is the bass player going to play an upright or an electric? And all those things are ready and available. And then we talk through that, and then we start playing it, see how it goes, do a couple takes, make some adjustments. That's kind of like, I'm just sort of explaining how a session would normally go. And so we go through all that and record a couple songs. And on the third day of the 3-day thing, we kind of mix, like, as far as I can go in the mix process. And that's it. That's what the Henhouse Hang is.
See, to me, that absolutely is like serving a next generation. Now, I don't know who shows up for your events, whether it's just folks who have an interest in how that works but are not musicians. But to me, if I was a new musician, like an emerging artist who didn't know those things, what better like playground to go and learn the basics? To me, that's how that sounds.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just that the people that we've had sign up generally are like on the older side. A lot of them are just like super keen music fans. And then there's some people that are like kind of, they've been doing it for a while, but they haven't done it the way that I do it. I haven't had any kids yet. Like, I don't mean kids, but like, haven't had any like 20-year-olds. It's been all sort of more like 40 plus so far. So that's why I hesitate saying it's catering to the next generation of people. I would like that. I think it would be cool if we could tap into that. But it's early days still too. Like, hopefully we'll gradually start getting more people like that. And it's just once a year right now. I guess if it was...
But you have one coming up, right? You want to talk dates?
Yeah, it's... when is it? September. So we pick it on purpose the week after. So there's an Americana festival here. And it's really good. It's like it's the main one. And people come from all over the world for it. And it's like, you know, it's one of those things where you buy a wristband for $100 and you can see 300 bands or whatever it is. Like, it's sort of a showcasey thing, you know, those things. So it's one of those, but it's all based on Americana music, and it sort of takes over Nashville, like about 15, 20 venues. So that's happening the week before. And so we always pick the week after that, because I just always assume that some people are going to be in town that wouldn't be here otherwise. And so that's why we do it. So our week this year is September 25 through 27. It's 25, 26, 27 is when we're doing it. And the Americana conference happens from like the 19th to the 23rd. So that's why we look at the dates that they do, and we start a couple days after that ends. And I think that's been wise, because that seems to be like when people are coming to town here. And you know, most people that end up signing up for this thing end up most likely going to Americana as well, just because it's there and it's happening and it's pretty good.
And at the end, we'll talk about all of your contact and all of that, but just specifically for this, if someone was interested in attending the Henhouse Hang, where should they go?
All the info is at stevedawson.ca. Not my Chicago doppelganger, Steve Dawson, who is, I think, stevedawson.com. So I'm stevedawson.ca, and I can't remember what the rest of it is. It's /
something that makes sense. I'm sure that they can navigate to it.
/ henhouse-hang. But if you go to the front page, there's a menu on the top right, and it's got the Henhouse Hang 2023, and it's got the dates and the cost and all that stuff, details and who the musicians are and all that.
I just think it sounds like a super cool event.
It's pretty cool.
So that was actually just the first half of my interview with Steve. As you guys probably have figured out by now, the interviews get split into 2 episodes. So make sure you come back Thursday for the rest of this interview, because Steve's got so much great stuff to share. We take a real winding road talking about, both the playing and the production and Vancouver and Nashville and all sorts of things, but there's such great information.